Today we're at Martha's Vineyard and going to be doing a painting of the Edgartown lighthouse. Beautiful lighthouse in the quaint town of Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. And I'm using an image that was supplied by Vineyard Colors, two photographers who take daily photos down on the vineyard, and some of them are so beautiful and they encourage artists and businesses to use them. So I'm using that as my image source today, and going to be talking about graded washes and how we can use these graded washes to create this time of day and the reflections and light bounce that we see in the sky and on the ground. So you see me starting with a bit of yellow ochre into the sky, using a big mop brush so that I can really saturate the paper. The reason being, it gives me more time to manipulate the color. I'll even take a small spray bottle to keep that wash alive so that I can manipulate it and not wind up with cauliflowers or accidentals. So into this wash I'm adding cerulean blue and cobalt blue. Cerulean at the top, and then as it comes down lower, a little bit of cobalt blue. And you notice that the color's kind of flowing down, and I'm mixing the paint on the paper. This is a great way to achieve a gradual changing of color, which we see a lot in nature. This sort of graded wash I use again and again, not just for skies, but for shadows, for the sides of buildings, for water, for all kinds of surfaces where I want to create this feeling of bouncing light, of light that's changing, of light that's bouncing around. The difficulty in this wash is keeping it wet, keeping it workable, because it's a large wash. The brush helps me here, and that spray bottle helps me here, and a little speed with the brush is also helping me. And tilting the paper so that the color is running down. It's hard to perceive over this short time, but color is kind of running down towards the horizon. And as it dries, the gradation becomes smoother and smoother and smoother until at some point it's almost imperceptible how the color is changing. And that's one of the beautiful hallmarks of this graded wash. I'm doing a graded wash on the bottom as well. The colors are darker. I started with a very strong yellow ochre. Into that I'm working cobalt blue and a bit of neutral tint or black. Neutral tint is good because it doesn't impart any temperature to the previous wash, so it just tints the color. And you can see in these two washes I've covered nearly 90% of the paper. And of course some things will be added as the painting dries, but in general these two washes account for a big part of the effect, the final effect in the painting. As I continue, I'm going to be looking for other places to use a graded wash, either a large one or a small one. Right now I'm doing the distant land, the bluffs just beyond the lighthouse on the far side of the water. These bluffs too are receiving light. Light is coming over our left shoulder and falling on the top of the lighthouse. It's also illuminating the sky so that we see a bit more light on the right hand side, a bit more shadow on the left hand side. So this is another slight gradation in that upper wash. This lower wash is still wet. It's an opportunity to add these strokes that I'm putting now. The strokes are very thick paint with a smaller brush. That's key. If you want the shape to hold its form and not just bleed out and become sort of unreadable, you need to adjust your brush, go to a smaller brush, and make sure the paint is thick. And it always pays to kind of test it. If you're painting into a wet area, test it, put the mark down and watch it. If it doesn't move much, you know you've got the right consistency for marks like this. If it starts to drift and drift and drift, you know that you have too much water in the mixture and that you need more paint. This is one of the harder aspects of watercolor to come to know, which is paint consistency. As we know, watercolor tends to dry light, and if it's a weak wash, it dries even lighter. So learning to anticipate that, learning to judge the consistency of the paint on your brush is one of the more difficult skills. Painting the clouds now, and my working thought is to get a nice feeling of brush strokes. These clouds, the pattern of clouds that we saw in the photograph is interesting, and it's also, in terms of design, very practical or useful for this particular image, because the ascending clouds sort of wind their way behind the lighthouse, making the lighthouse appear brighter. They rise in the sky, which creates an interesting movement. They join at the horizon and they fragment at top, which gives us a rough version of a gradient. In other words, it's a good pattern for us to emulate, the pattern that was present in the photograph. So I'm using that and possibly adding a few more clouds where I think they're going to be most effective. Near the top of the lighthouse where I have a bright light, and so on. Looking at Winslow Homer, you can see how he manipulated his cloud shapes solely for a purpose of design. They do give you of course, a representation of the particular sky, the type of weather, the type of light, but he uses those shapes and lights and darks in the clouds to really help his design. So if you're looking for someone to study in watercolor how they manipulated clouds, Winslow Homer is a great source of information, and especially his lean towards design. Another gradient in the water. This is going from darker on the left side to a little lighter on the right side. So far we've made use of 1, 2, 3 gradients, and before this painting is over, we'll add a 4th gradient into the lighthouse itself. The sky gradient is made particularly difficult because we're working around that shape of the lighthouse. If we're just going straight across, we have a much easier go of it. When we have to cut around a shape, it just makes the continuity of the wash that much more tricky and difficult. And of course we could apply masking compound, which preserves the white of the paper. I don't use masking compound for a couple of reasons. One, I find it hard to control, hard to get the edge that I want, hard to manipulate with any predictability. And more importantly for me is I like to be able to see the white of the paper to judge the strength of my colors. If I used masking compound in this case to paint over or to isolate the lighthouse and did my wash, I would lose the white of the paper. I wouldn't see it anymore. It'd be harder to relate the values of the sky and certainly the values of the clouds. So that's my reason for not using masking compound, my 2 reasons. Anyway, I love preserving the white of the paper, and you notice that I've kept a few whites in the painting. I do that regularly. I try to keep white in the paper, an abundance of white often, and then as I'm refining the image, knock back those whites with a little wash or a little color, or leave them through the end of the painting. And they add a little bit of sparkle to the painting, they add a little bit of energy, so I often leave them even in the finished piece. working out the details now. This is the painstaking part. It's not as enjoyable for me, but it really finalizes the painting. It brings all of these light washes together and concentrates the area of direct light right on the top of our lighthouse, so that you can feel the light coming over the shoulder and resting and finding the top of the lighthouse. This painting I used cobalt blue, cerulean blue, yellow ochre, some cad red, and some neutral tint. So it's not an overly busy palette. And that's for the reason of keeping the color unified. I feel sometimes we want to reach for every color that we have on our palette because we have them. And we're trying to often match color too precisely, and I think that gets in the way of successful painting. So I very often use a limited palette, and I find that I get a stronger result in the end. And it's a more pleasurable painting experience because I don't try to emulate color too much. I concentrate more on catching the light, or catching the, let's say, tonal values through color. So it's really assuming a finished quality now. You can see how those darks are important, and as the painting dries, these colors will settle and become more even. And well, here's the finished piece. You can see the color is dried pretty much as it was, and how those gradient washes combine to give us this glowing effect of that late evening sky. Thank you.